Hi everyone, Harvey Young here, and I would say thank you for the invitation to offer this keynote address. Today's talk is entitled Crises of the Live, and today what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few stories which I hope will elucidate how the conventional understanding of what is live and what feels live has changed over the past year. These stories or core case studies will touch on examples which I confess are not traditionally theatrical, such as an in-person street protest in Chicago, Honk for Justice Chicago, and an online song battle featuring R&B singers Patti LaBelle and Gladys Knight. But they serve as extreme examples which I hope will make it easier to appreciate the evolution in thinking about liveness and performance. Together, these stories will cohere in support of the following assertion, and that is that live performance is a state of mind, an imagined co-presence in time with others. And this assertion bears repeating. Live performance is a state of mind, an imagined co-presence in time with others. This is not a radical departure from how we conventionally think about the live, which is a well-researched and well-documented area. But the emphasis today, understood through the lens of a global pandemic and indexed by both blackness and activism, is how live performance is partially a thing produced by a creator and also a feeling imagined by the spectator/audience member. Furthermore, I will suggest that live performance considered in this manner has the following attributes, again with an emphasis on reception. 1. It has an urgency to be seen. It is comprised of a series of moments deemed unmissable to the extent that anxiety, a profound fear of missing out, occurs if you dare to step away. And 2. It has an essential connection to an historical past premised on theater as an act of sociality, inspired by a need to be with others. Now, as theaters begin to reopen across North America, and as many theater companies have announced their abbreviated summer seasons or revealed plans to resume production in the fall, it has become increasingly common for people to wax nostalgic and share their memories of theater before the pandemic, specifically the last play they saw before theaters were closed. Their retreat into nostalgia whets the appetite for the experience on the horizon. So, here's my pandemic story. In November 2019, I received an email from Lee McKeska Gartner, artistic director of the Nora Theater Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Gartner invited me to participate in a central conversation following a performance of their co-production with WAM Theater, WAM Theater in the Berkshires, of Dominique Morisseau's play Pipeline. I agreed. We selected Thursday, March 12th, 2020, 3 days after opening night for what would essentially be a talkback. I had no inkling then that Pipeline would be the last play I would see in person before a global pandemic shuttered theaters for more than a year. In November 2019, the world at large had not yet been alerted to the dangers of COVID-19. However, 5 months later, when I walked into the sold-out performance at the Central Square Theater and saw fewer than 24 people assembled, I knew then that the future of live performance was in jeopardy. 3 days later, the state required all theaters to close. Now, I will admit, I had hoped that week that the conversation would be canceled. It wasn't. I entered a quiet, mostly empty lobby. There was a palpable nervous energy among the ushers and production staff. It wasn't pre-show jitters, but a fear that the show would be shut down. Audience members scattered themselves throughout the theater. I had a row all to myself. Others had entire sections. Although I've experienced plenty of sparsely attended productions in my life, the Pipeline audience distribution was my first experience with what I now recognize as pandemic-related social distancing. Following the governor's directive to end large public gatherings, Pipeline joined the first wave of professional theaters to pivot to online streaming. Audience members were encouraged to pay what you can to access a recorded production, performance that is, while being steered to a series of suggested donation levels from friend, $10, to angel, $200. The urgency of the donation and the potential threat of the pandemic on the arts were relayed by the production team, and I quote, "Know that your purchase of this pre-recorded video stream event will help sustain Central Square Theater artists and staff while we are dark." And here I want to show you a sort of a snippet of the trailer, actually. I want to show you the trailer for Pipeline that I saw at Nora Theater Company. So here it is.
Rocks. They change in form, made from heat and pressure. That's what makes them so rare and interesting.
And that's me.
That's you.
I don't think you'll... Nah, you do. You don't want to, but you do.
Principal Cody said we're working on getting more surveillance.
What the hell is the point of the security cameras they put in if they're not going to scare out these hoodlums?
And who he looking at when he asking all these questions, Mom? Who he looking at?
Oh, Mom.
Like I'm the spokesperson.
He felt harassed by the teacher more so than the other students. He felt targeted.
They don't care about your
Exactly. They don't care, Ma. They don't care what space and place I'm in.
So returning to the production I attended, there was a felt sense of urgency at the performance which stemmed from the uncertainty of when, not if, the show would be shut down. Collectively, we were inhabiting and sharing a moment exceeding what was framed by the playwright. Beyond the story world of the play, we were in time together as we were realizing that our routines were about to shift, without having any sense of for how long. However, we knew that our show, if it closed prematurely, probably would never return. Collectively, we could sense impending loss, and together we leaned in to emotionally support the production. The theater, which was nearly empty, felt full because we were so clearly engaged and wanted to imagine an experience, including an audience that wasn't there, or more accurately, would have been there if not for the threat of the pandemic. Pipeline proved prescient not only in the ways it revealed how institutions and audiences would operate in the throes of a pandemic, but also in the manner it placed a spotlight on racism within societal systems. Its title refers to the school-to-prison pipeline, the confluence of education policies and under-resourced public schools in a predominantly punitive juvenile system that drastically increases the likelihood that at-risk children will end up with a criminal record rather than a high school diploma. Pipeline centers on Omari, a high school student at a private college prep school, and Naya, his mother who teaches at a public school. There is an undercurrent of racism and elitism, which makes it difficult for Omari to fit in. He feels the weight of being assumed to represent all black people and being subjected to the stereotypical ideas of blackness held by others, including his teachers. It is his frustration at his life situation which leads to a key offstage action. Omari shoves a teacher, an act which could result in suspension and being charged with a crime. In Naya's school, the teachers in their break room share stories about school fights, but also about inadequate staffing as well as poor mental health counseling, which impairs the life chances of their students. The systemic problems are so great across schools that Naya, speaking about her son, laments, and I quote, "It doesn't matter where I send him to school, nothing's working. He's being sucked into this void, and I keep trying to hold on to him, but the force is so strong that I have to hold on firm or I'll lose my grip. The void is prison or perhaps death at the hands of law enforcement." Ed Siegel, reviewing the production for Boston area public radio, critiqued Pipeline for its politics and asserted, and I quote, "There's still an obligation for playwrights to not let agendas, whether they be community building or political postulating, to get in the way of storytelling." Whereas Siegel framed the play as being too political, Bill Marks, in Arts Views, argued the opposite. He asserted that Morrisell's play would have been even more effective if it focused more on systemic problems than family drama between Omari and his parents. He writes, and I quote, "Remaking ourselves and our institutions in ways that would mitigate Omari's rage would make for a far more formidable but viable teaching play. But that would mean stepping out of the comfortable confines of realism and calling out the powerful." End quote. Personally, the production felt honest, perhaps because there was a sincerity in the enterprise of putting on a show in a looming pandemic, and therein was its effectiveness. Or to put it another way, the urgency of engaging the problem of racism required that we venture out to the theater and show up. Looking back after a year of nationwide protest related to police abuse and the experiences of black folk, Pipeline proved timely. Although the Nora Wham production predates the murder of American George Floyd, it correctly read the mood of everyday citizens tired of witnessing Black death and ready to take to the streets. Although critiqued for this agenda, Nora Theater Company was unapologetic, and I quote, "Art is our activism, and our production of Pipeline exemplifies this mission." End quote. I remember leaving the theater feeling not anxious about a looming pandemic, but rather grateful for the ways theater can be a catalyst for change. There was something reassuring about this lesson of the necessity of showing up, the urgency of attending, the power of presence, which reflected our moment and revealed the possibilities of the live. Part 2. Honk for Justice. 2 months after I attended the production of Pipeline in Greater Boston, and only days after the murder of George Floyd on May 25, 2020 in Minneapolis, artist-activist Jocelyn Prince attended protests and marches on the south side of Chicago. Concurrently, people took to the streets across the U.S. and Canada, in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, among other cities. In Chicago, Jocelyn witnessed the overwhelming show of force by the Chicago Police Department. Their intimidating presence seemed out of proportion to the peaceful demonstration, which itself was a response to the killing of an unarmed black man by a police officer. Several Chicago protesters would be beaten by members of the CPD that day, others at subsequent protests. Prince remembers, and I quote, "I began to get frustrated that while people on the south side of Chicago were being beaten in the streets protesting murder by police, white people on the north side were going about their daily business, chatting about their kids' summer camps or how long the line is at Whole Foods. When Madison reached out to me to ask me if I knew of any protests happening elsewhere in the city, I said we should make our own." Prince and Camp started their own protest, Honk for Justice Chicago, which would become the longest sustained demonstration related to George Floyd's murder in the city. Prince researched city ordinances concerning street demonstrations. Together they devised a concept for a visibility protest which could take place on sidewalks and therefore would not require permits. Although simple in design, they understood that the impact of these initial events would increase if they could attract people to join in and participate in the protest over successive days. They leveraged social media, creating Facebook events, initially for the first two protests, and circulating information via other outlets, Instagram, Twitter, and more. What began with less than a dozen volunteers on the first day quickly expanded. The next days, the second day's protest in Rogers Park's neighborhood began with a couple dozen participants. At the start, Prince gathered the small group in a circle on the grass near a field house. She used the people's microphone, which is when a crowd repeats everything that a speaker says for amplification, to point out a comfort station with water, first aid, and other supplies. Prince led the group to repeat the words of Assata Shakur, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. It is our duty to win. We must love each other. We must love each other and support each other. And support each other. We have nothing to lose. We have nothing to lose but our chains. But our chains." Within a few hours, the crowd swelled to several hundred people who gathered for blocks along Sheridan Road, a major four-lane street in the city. Protesters held up signs with slogans reading "Honk for Justice" and "White silence is violence." Some were passerbys who found themselves compelled to join in. Most people who were there learned about it less than 24 hours earlier on Facebook. People of all ages and races attended the protest. Some banged pots and pans, another person played a trombone. Police officers in riot gear arrived. They came with empty buses for mass arrests. Despite the presence of the police and their buses, the Honk for Justice protest in Rogers Park ended peacefully. There were no acts of violence. None of the hundreds of protesters were arrested. Nevertheless, the presence of law enforcement officers dressed in preparation for violence reminded everyone why Honk for Justice Chicago was necessary. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd, a black man who was accused of using a fake $20 bill at a convenience store, was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis. Handcuffed with hands behind his back, he was forced to lay down, face down on the street, with multiple officers kneeling on him, including one who kneeled on his neck. George Floyd pleaded for breath. "I can't breathe." He repeated those words more than 20 times. A crowd gathered, calling for the officers to stop and to allow the man to breathe. For nearly 9 minutes, the lead officer continued to kneel on George Floyd's neck until life drained from his body. The murder, recorded on cellular phones and police body cameras, was replayed on the news and shared across social media. Nationally, people took to the streets in protest of this particular death, as well as dozens of recent murders of black people by the police that had inspired the Black Lives Matter movement. The first Honk for Justice Chicago protest in Westtown occurred 8 days after the murder of George Floyd. It was a death that resonated because of its alignment with our other death by police scenarios and its unavoidable spectacle. Prince remembers, and I quote, "I will never be the same after watching that video. It was like watching a televised lynching. I cried for days. I had nightmares. I dreamt that my brother or other black men I loved were under that officer's knee. I was most horrified by what I saw in that following days, white people going about their business as if nothing had happened. I found that sort of desensitization to violence against black bodies disturbing." What was needed was an intervention to help folks, especially those who lived in Chicago's North Side, to understand that had George Floyd's skin complexion been different, had he been white, he likely would still be alive. To raise awareness, Honk for Justice Chicago needed to be a durational event, perhaps a marathon protest, that occurred not just on one day in one part of the city, but rather every day throughout Chicago. It would run for 60 consecutive days between June 2nd, 2020 and August 1st, 2020. In the style of a field organizer on a political campaign, Jocelyn Prince hosted volunteer trainings. Each began with her telling her story. who she was, why and how she got there. Prince was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. Her father was a lawyer active in local politics who ran unsuccessfully in 3 judicial races and later was appointed a judge by a state official. Prince knocked on her first doors when she was 12 years old, getting petition signatures to get her father's name on the ballot. She would become a staff organizer on the 2008 Obama for America campaign and the 2016 Hillary for America presidential campaign as well. In the year preceding Honk for Justice, Prince worked in Iowa for Kamala Harris. With a parallel career in theater, she organized and facilitated town halls designed to foster a dialogue among activists, academics, artists, policymakers, and interested community members to identify potential next steps and an action plan for change. As the connectivity director at Woolly Mammoth Theater Company in Washington, D.C. Partnering with Prince was Madison Camp, a recent college graduate and an advocate for diversity and inclusion who met Prince through a Bradley University debate team alumni group. Joining Prince and Camp were a core group of volunteers, the Yellow Jackets. The Yellow Jackets were engaged theater artists who, like the co-founders, felt compelled to act and speak out. They were Tom Cox, Sonny Saris, David O'Donnell, Dana Bucheri, and Stacey Berglund. Cox, a professional theater actor and a founding member of the Tony Award-winning regional theater Looking Glass Theater Company, recalls feeling angry at the murder of George Floyd and possessing a desire to, and I quote, take action in the face of power that knew it wasn't accountable, end quote. Sonny Saris, a local college professor, remembers deliberately avoiding the video of George Floyd's murder for a week, and upon watching it, she remarks, she believed it to be the first lynching that I've ever seen. The Yellow Jackets became a cast and crew of sorts. They set up a staging area for volunteers and participants, which included bottled water, snacks, poster boards, markers, signs, and other supplies. To spotlight the intervention, Honk for Justice was a theater-inspired performance of activism. With theaters closed, the streets served as the stage for public demonstration for change. With social distancing in place and gatherings in general discouraged, activist theater became the site where participants, as well as passerbys, could forge connection. They could be in time and in place together, not just once, but for 2 months, a potentially enduring familiarity made possible by a pandemic, societal unrest, and a longing for interpersonal connection. The streets offered access to a feeling of communitas no longer available through a physical theater. Daily pop-up protests continued with the location announced on Facebook the night before. The logistics of this proved cumbersome, which led Prince and Camp alongside the Yellow Jackets to choose 7 locations on the north side of the city, 1 for each day of the week. Uptown, Westtown, Logan Square, Lincoln Park, Rogers Park, and West Ridge. This cycle was repeated every week for nearly 2 months. To further promote Honk for Justice Chicago, a website was created, www.honkforjusticechicago.com. The site is still up, which included a schedule of events, photos, and published pieces about the protest. The site offered succinct overview of the ambitions of the project. And, I will read at length, their overview here. Every day we protest at a different intersection on the north side of Chicago from 4 to 6 p.m., occupying the sidewalks, waving signs, chanting, making noise, and getting drivers to honk their horns in support. This event is family friendly. Kids are more than welcome. Bring signs and anything that makes noise, pots and pans, whistles, musical instruments. We have a limited stock of pre-made signs as well as poster board and markers. We have water, snacks, masks, and basic first aid supplies on hand. Helium black balloons are also a great thing to bring for children and even adults. Sign suggestions include Black Lives Matter, Silence is Violence, Black is Beautiful, and Justice for George Floyd. When you arrive at the intersection, please look for volunteers in Yellow Jackets. You can show up at Honk for Justice anytime between 4 and 6 p.m., but we encourage you to attend our 10-minute training, which begins promptly at 4 p.m. We protest rain or shine. We encourage all participants to wear a mask and practice social distancing. Although we are not directly affiliated with the Black Lives Matter organization, we ask that you support the great work that they do to organize us all around racial justice. Donate at blacklivesmatter.com. Face coverings were requested not for the purpose of anonymity, but rather in accordance with city and state guidelines requiring masking in an effort to curtail the COVID-19 public health crisis that was occurring concurrent with the Honk for Justice Chicago. The Yellow Jackets wore neon yellow vests with thin orange stripes similar to those worn by crossing guards or construction workers. The vests served multiple functions. They helped volunteers and first-time protesters to identify key organizers for that particular protest. They further marked Honk for Justice as a formally organized event rather than an accidental gathering. In addition, they helped to provide visual consistency from event to event. As the days passed, the Yellow Jackets replaced Jocelyn Prince, the person with megaphone in hand, training volunteers. Camp remembers those moments of leading the team to be the most challenging, even for a person like herself, who likes speaking in front of people. She remembers thinking about service to and for community each time she addressed the volunteers. And I quote, "This is not about you, Madison. It's about the movement and the support of the Black community." End quote. Honk for Justice Chicago worked with 2 volunteer publicists who coordinated press releases, handled outreach, and provided media training to Prince, Camp, and the Yellow Jackets. Protests were covered by a gamut of local, regional, and national press. Chicago's PBS news station featured Honk for Justice as part of a neighborhood profile series on Lincoln Square. Nick Bloomberg, a journalist, reports, and I quote, "And as with many Chicago neighborhoods, demonstrations for racial justice have been making noise, in this case literally. The demonstration Honk for Justice has been coming to Lincoln Square every Thursday." End quote. In the televised segment, Prince appears saying, and I quote, "We want to keep the volume up so that people here on the North Side understand what Black people are going through, not just here in Chicago, but around the country." End quote. In a video essay on Chicago's protest created and published by the Washington Post, the newspaper that is, Honk for Justice appears prominently with Prince interviewed. As enthusiasm for the protest began to wane, Prince, who eventually became the sole lead organizer after other obligations limited Camp's involvement, found herself having to do more and more organizing work to get people to attend. She reflected on her own efforts and by extension the labor of Black women, which often drives social movements. Prince considered the inability of Black women to rest, which in turn inspired a performance which would last for the remainder of Honk for Justice. She thought, what would it be like if instead of standing and wearing a bright yellow jacket, she wore a dress, a summer dress, brought a beach chair, and just sat down? The theatricality of the daily protests increased. In addition to the summer dress and beach chair, Prince added a variety of new costume and set pieces, including a large straw beach hat, a beach towel, a white tub for soaking her feet, magazines, a parasol, and a hand fan. Throughout the protest, she refused to speak with passerbys. If someone approached her, a yellow jacket would intervene and let the person know that Jocelyn is resting and cannot be disturbed. This improvisational approach became a ritual that symbolized how Black women consistently are asked for unpaid labor and the ways white allies might interrupt that dynamic. In its coverage of Honk for Justice, the Chicago Reader, a free newspaper, spotlighted this performance art twist. And I quote, "When Prince is there, she sits in a long chair reading. White volunteers serve as mediators between her and anyone else who wants to interact with her, telling them, as Prince says, 'No, she's resting. She needs to rest. You can talk to me.'" And here I want to show you an excerpt from the Washington Post coverage of Honk for Justice.
Despite the violence in some areas, many took to the streets.
It's time for white people to pick up the mantle. The reason that I'm sitting here in, a summer dress, soaking my feet, is to call attention to the fact that Black women have been doing a lot of organizing work for progressive politics for decades and decades and centuries. And it's time for white people to do that work. It is far past time for Black people to rest.
If Pipeline was challenged as a teaching play, Honk for Justice Chicago should be considered a teaching performance. It centered the live as an opportunity to educate and position allies as proactive agents in support of a movement for social change. It leveraged physical proximity, a standing yellow jacket sitting next to a sitting Prince, to model how a community could support one another and share the burden of leadership. Also, this iteration of the live was both durational and immediate. Yes, there were 60 opportunities to participate. However, embodied within each was the urgency of the moment to stand up for Black people targeted by structural racism. Rain or shine, Honk for Justice Chicago aligns with the history of social activism and protest within Chicago. Its emergence, beginning with an exchange between Madison Camp and Jocelyn Prince, has its roots in the sympathy strikes of the past, in which Chicagoans felt compelled to stand up and step out in support of an outrage occurring elsewhere. Owing to Prince's training in theater and performance studies, its borrowing of Boalian techniques is also identifiable. The audience becomes an agent for change. Although successful, there were numerous challenges encountered by Prince and Camp and their team of Yellow Jackets. Among the more significant were the efforts required to sustain Honk for Justice Chicago over 60 days. Every day, volunteers were needed to occupy sidewalks and publicly call for justice. These individuals had to be recruited. New participants required training. Whereas recruitment on sunny and warm weekends was not difficult, rainy weekdays proved more complicated. Participation could range from hundreds of people to just 2, depending on the day. Cox remembers, and I quote, "To continue standing up knowing that there may be very few people coming, rainstorm, or days and times where there are only 2, 3 people showing up, it takes an extra heft," end quote. Part of the required heft was the realization that at times an entire movement can rest on the shoulders of 1 or 2 people. It is literally a pair of people standing up, almost against the city, for justice. Sarahs recalls her most challenging times as, and I quote, "those moments when I was by myself and it was just jostling me. I was really in a vulnerable spot. I noticed that I would get yelled at and picked on when it was just me, but it was also some of the most rewarding too," end quote. In part, the reward was the self-acknowledgement of the importance of individual activism, the idea that a person can make a difference. A person can create and compose an event. History sometimes records activism as a series of dynamic snapshots, a person holding a sign or standing up to and directly facing a police officer, for example. However, protests have a soundtrack. Honk for Justice was no exception. There were the voices of people chanting in the words of Assata Shakur and Jocelyn Prince, of course. There were the amplified words of Prince, Camp, the Yellow Jackets on the megaphones for the daily trainings. There were the improvisatory statements of participants, the banging of pots and pans, and yes, even the person on a trombone. Sarah's fondly remembers the large number of bus drivers, post office workers, FedEx drivers, Amazon delivery drivers who would honk and wave and yell. She adds, and I quote, "I remember just being on the north side and having people hanging out of their cars with excitement that there was a protest happening in their neighborhood." Sarah's also notes the positive impact of supporters on low attendance days, saying, "You're alone? We respect you." There were also detractors. With the protests occurring in the summer of 2020 and the months leading up to the presidential contest between Donald Trump and Joseph Biden, Honk for Justice attracted the ire of people who viewed the protests as activism against Trump. Sarah's notes, and I quote, "The amount of rage people had is surprising. How can you feel rage about someone standing up for themselves? That level of rage was mind-blowing," end quote. Cox remembers people approaching him in an intimidating manner and launching into aggressive debate. Referring to the sense of being physically threatened, he reflected, and I quote, "That has always been the case with any protest against racial oppression. That is the nature of the conversation, and it has always been. I had to return to myself to feeling to that I had to be willing to be unsafe. I was putting myself at risk in a way that I wasn't accustomed to," end quote. Participation in these daily protests, especially the rainy weekday gatherings, prompted self-examination, a return to self that helped the volunteer to see themselves as part of a larger community, and equally importantly, to understand how their activism can make a difference and affect change. The visibility and extended duration of the protest not only raised awareness to the justifiable outrage at George Floyd's murder, but also captured the attention of a city on the power of live activist performance. The impact of Honk for Justice extended beyond the individual responses of participants. It also affected passerbys who found themselves in the midst of a protest, as it rotated daily among 7 distinct neighborhoods. They became participant observers in a manner reminiscent of theater in the round or runway spectators. As performance scholar Jordan Schildkraut writes, and I quote, "Even if an audience member is focused on the performers, they inevitably see their fellow audience members on the other side of the stage and are reciprocally seen. This mutual visibility could produce a variety of effects: curiosity, anxiety, desire, but it necessarily makes one more aware of one's own visibility in relation to others sharing the space." Some people felt antagonized. Sarahs notes that when she participated in a Honk for Justice Chicago protest, someone would yell Trump 2020 every single time. Tom Cox remembers a man who was being territorial in the last protest in West Ridge. The man declared, "Why are you doing this in a residential neighborhood? You're in my neighborhood. This is why people come to hate Black Lives Matter." The man walked away only to return with a megaphone. Cox remembers, "He pointed it at my ear and turned on the siren. 'How did you like it? That's what it sounds like.' And then he walked away. What if that had been a gun? He lifted it up and pointed it at my head in the way that you would a gun." End quote. This experience evidences theater scholar Harry Elam's assertion, and I quote, "In these turbulent times, social activists become protagonists in their own real-life drama." Other passerbys found inspiration and hope. An especially poignant moment for Sarah's was when, and I quote, "a bus driver got off the bus to thank me," end quote. American society is rife with loud moral protest, writes James Jasper. Honk for Justice Chicago represents the spirit of activism within the Windy City. For weeks and across 7 distinct neighborhoods, Chicagoans gathered to protest injustice afar, specifically George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, and also closer to home. Consisting of 60 individual events, Honk for Justice Chicago evidences the depth of activist spirit in Chicago. It also served as a reminder that activism can incite resistance to change. There were honks for justice. There were passerbys who sought to silence the protest. In making the challenges to justice visible, Prince and Camp's campaign spotlighted not only the labor, but also the real obstacles to creating lasting change. The effort to bring about change needs to be ongoing and must be of extended duration. As Sheila Radford Hill has observed, and I quote, "Deep within the soul of grassroots organizing are a thirst for freedom that cannot be quenched, a hunger for justice that cannot be satiated, a will to succeed that cannot be denied, and a desire to build a legacy of change that will pass on to new generations." The links between theater and activism were strengthened in 2020, embodied, live, and event. The performance dimension of the protest provided a substitute for what previously occurred on stage. It was as if Pipeline moved to the streets in a way reminiscent of Amiri Baraka literally moving his production of Dutchman to the streets of Harlem not long after its premiere. Honk for Justice Chicago emphasized this new approach to liveness, framed from the perspective of the audience. It began with a pronounced desire to render blackness seen. There was an urgency to be recognized, to have the experience of racism acknowledged, to be heard. Honk, both the durational performances and the individual sounds of cars passing by, existed as an intervention on the landscape. It also figured the creator Prince ultimately as the spectator silently watching her own creation. Of course, Honk for Justice also served as a reminder that performance is an expression of community care and connection. Verses. This past spring semester, I taught a class at Boston University centered on African American theater. Along the way, I invited in a variety of playwrights via Zoom to join in the discussion. Among them was Terrell McCraney, author of the play Choir Boy, but probably still best known for the film Moonlight, based on one of his early plays. We talked about the challenges of live theater in the pandemic and the explosion of stream productions as well as the rise of Zoom theater, essentially a form of online readers theater. Our conversation turned to whether these online activities were adequate substitutes for the live event. McCraney shared his opinion that most Zoom theater lacked a sense of urgency and couldn't quite command your attention. Quite simply, he stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you feel as though you can walk away from the screen, perhaps to go to the bathroom or to the kitchen for a snack, then it is missing that essential feature of liveness that separates theater from film and television. McCraney suggested Verses, the online singing battle between rhythm and blues divas and producers as well, as an example of what a live event should be. With a hat tip to the esteemed playwright, I want to spotlight Verses, not Zoom theater, with one exception, which you'll see a bit later, as an example of the urgency of the live as well as its analog, the anxiety of the missed occurrence. Verses, spelled with 2 Z's rather than 2 S's, is essentially an online social media forum available via Instagram Live, in which 2 musical artists take turns singing or playing their hits, often at the request of viewers who submit their comments, viewable to all via chat bubbles. Judy Rosen, writing for the New York Times, notes, "The title evokes a heavyweight bout, and the episodes unfold like a boxing match. Each round presents a track from each artist, with viewers encouraged to pick the victor on a song-by-song basis. Fans/viewers/audience members express their thoughts via chat bubbles. A single word or more, a phrase kind of popping up on the screen on the side there. It is probably the world's friendliest battle, as the artists repeatedly express respect for one another, and consistently viewers share their appreciation for the virtuosity on display." So here I want to show you an excerpt from the Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle Verses. So here it is.
Luther, all of our son, your son. Luther. I was with you when your son passed. Yeah. You were with me when all of my sisters passed. Yes. So we've been in it together. Yes. And it kept us moving. It did. Because they would want us to stop. They would not want us to stop.
Well, we'll do it for them as well.
That's what we do.
You know, music is in our spirits and in our souls. God.
It's a healing,
and they're a blessing.
Yes.
So,
yes. Girl, we talk the same talk.
Yeah, we do. We always
like
have.
That, yes. Wow. True stories.
Yeah. it's up to us. You're just smiling this morning. All of your love is wishing you well. Your tears they just swell. Make yours a happy home. Make yours a happy ooh, and the love inside. Whoa. I got a happy cry. I wanna be what pleases you. So long as there is peace with you, that's all I can do. So make yours a happy home. Make yours a happy. I wanna do you right. Love you out of sight. I wanna be what pleases you. So long as there is peace with you, that's all I can do. So make yours a happy home. Make yours a happy home. Oh yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, 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 yeah. We can do it. We can do it now, baby. I get full of pride and so sanctified. You don't have to be for me, no superstar. I love you just the way you are. So make yours a happy home. Make yours a happy. I wanna do you right and love you out of sight. I wanna be what pleases you. So long as there is peace with you. Yeah. Love you out of sight, girl.
Girl, I love that too.
I'm telling you.
Well, keep on singing.
You
I'm a
always doing
fan.
that, Patty.
I am a fan of yours.
I'm a fan of yours too.
Yeah, we're equal.
Grew up together.
Versus is also a virtual Black community which revels in the experience of Blackness for its own sake. Judy Rosen writes, nearly every artist to appear in Versus is Black, and the show makes no concessions to any other audience. Non-Black viewers enter its virtual spaces as eavesdroppers on an in-group conversation. The point of these battles is not to choose winners, but to luxuriate in the glories of the Black pop canon and the community forged by that body of music. The critic Craig Jenkins, writing about a matchup between Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle, rendered the following verdict that could be applied to the whole Versus enterprise. Blackness won. It is the virtual assembly, the gathering of hundreds of thousands of people, the majority of whom self-identify as Black, that contributes to Versus' innovation and liveness. A battle is an event. It is a church of sort that happens at a specific time and place. It demands that you show up or otherwise miss out, despite the fact that it may be mediated. The urgency of the live is your awareness of the presence of others, not just the featured performers, but also other audience members with their chat bubble assertions of presence. Part of the power, the liveness of the event, comes from knowing that you and others, despite geographical distance, are sharing in the same moment, the same experience. This liveness creates a sense of proximity, of being together, despite the social distancing restrictions of a pandemic. This awareness of others is aided by the presence of familiar, recognizable celebrities as audience members whose posted thoughts add to the experience and thrill. Michael B. Jordan and I are watching Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle. Yes, it may be possible to watch the battle later as recording, but the glimmer of the live has faded because you no longer are watching it in time with others. I want to separate out Versus from other event cinema, which has been extensively studied in connection with liveness. It is not akin to the film version of Hamilton or the opera and live series such as the National Theatre Live or the Met Opera Live. In those cases, the assumption is that the mediated viewers are vicariously, via the recording or live stream, gathered at a specific venue at a particular time. For example, we are transported to an opera house in Italy as if we were audience members. and this is what I'm saying, is not equivalent to verses. Because we're not trying to vicariously visit a set location. It's something else instead. In the case of verses, the audience is the virtual audience. As a spectator, you join people who are geographically dispersed, but imaginatively envision themselves being together. And as a result, the result is a live, temporally co-present community structured not around the identity of the producer or even the venue, but rather through a desire to simply be together. And this is where the charge of the live emerges. To attend is to be part of a community that's imagined, comprised of disparately placed real people. There are other explicitly live moments in verses. Judy Rosen adds, and I quote, "The show retains a sense of that unscripted weirdness that may erupt at any moment. A battle between the dance hall titans Beanie Man and Bounty Killer, live streamed from Jamaica, was interrupted by the police. Beanie Man told them, the police, 'There are 500,000 people watching us right now from all over the world. Do you want to be that guy?' Essentially the guy who kind of shuts everything down. The R&B star Ashanti was forced to stall when her adversary Keisha Cole ran an hour late. The Wu-Tang Clan members Ghostface Killah and Raekwon finished off their battle singing and dancing to old disco hits. Although its scripted nature certainly leads to its in-the-moment spontaneity, I believe that Verse's sense of liveness stems not from the unscripted events of the performers, but in the unscripted responses of the live audience, those chat bubbles. It is here that Verses offers a lesson for live theater, emerging out of a pandemic. The presence of other spectators changes the event, even an event with a trajectory that is by design uncertain. Also, Verses serves as a trigger of memory. It invites memories of past events. It resurrects the past. It reanimates the paused. Mickey Kendall, writing for the NBC News, writes, or rather offers, "If you are too offline to know what Verses is, or too young to understand why everybody has been raving about Patti LaBelle and Gladys Knight on social media this weekend, let me help you out, sort of. You missed one of the greatest, possibly defining cultural events of this pandemic era." For Kendall, it was a cultural event, a performance that served as a memory trigger. She writes, and I quote, "Music weaves itself into our lives. It cements certain moments into our memories, evoking the smells, the feelings, and even the flavors that were integral to the first time we heard a given song. I can't tell you what was on top of the Billboard charts when I was 5 or 7 or even 11, because even though Patti LaBelle's and Gladys Knight's works were technically songs for Gen X parents or very cool grandparents, they were also the first music that many of us heard as kids." She adds, "I still associate it with chores, that music playing on a Saturday morning meant it was time to get up and clean, but also with feeling loved, with dancing with the broom, with singing into a ladle, and sitting in the kitchen, hearing the stories I wasn't old enough to hear. When my grandmother passed away, I listened to Patti LaBelle, Dionne Warwick, and Gladys Knight on a playlist whenever I wanted to remember that feeling of being a child in her kitchen. Nothing else brought those memories back so fast. There's something about the memories their music evokes for people, especially my age, that can be both a shared experience and yet utterly unique." Within theater studies, we refer to these moments or realizations as ghosting, right? Often framed as how the live event is haunted by the past performances, which we may or may not have witnessed. This is certainly a feature of Versus' liveness. However, there is more. It stages actual live performances, Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle, alongside memories of their past performances, which of course is aided by the singer's storytelling, but also as being connected to sets of individual memories, the soundtrack of individual lives. Versus calls forward to the present the past lives of people, the memories of being in the world with others across the years, and circulates those memories of liveness across the experience of being with others for an event. There's a blurring or a slippage, as performance scholar Rebecca Schneider might say, that adds to the sensation of the live. The dead live again. Memories of childhood imaginatively turn back the clock and replay again the live experience, which gets overlaid on the present. Patti LaBelle sings live and alongside the viewer/listener's childhood memory of her voice on the radio. It is not a memory of a past set of performances, but rather a variety of personally significant, unknowable performances that center at the shared site of embodied Black experience. It is communal, but also individual. Repeatable, but not always the same, anchored in the past, but recurring in the present. It is this idea of liveness entangled with Blackness and Black performance that excites me within our pandemic present. The crises of the live can best be described by the anxieties concerning shuttered theaters, masked and metaphorically silenced people, the loss of connection, touching, feeling through social distancing and social isolation, core to any idea of community. Looking back on the past year, I propose that it is these performances related to Blackness that make explicit alternate strategies and alternative possibilities of the live in the face of these crises. We have seen how Black artists and their audiences have succeeded in overcoming many, but obviously not all, of the challenges posed by the pandemic. I want to argue that they have restored and perhaps rehabilitated our sense of the live, even in moments in which conventional theater was not and could not happen. This was achieved through an entreaty to audiences to embrace an alternate look and feel for the live premised on the urgency of Black visibility, streaming pipeline, or street activism in Chicago, online song battles and verses, the creation of events provoking a felt sense of immediacy, the need to respond to the murder of George Floyd, the sensation of watching a performance in time with others, and the prompt to situate oneself either physically or imaginatively in a community inspired by the performance itself. I realize that my interest in the performance and experience of race, especially Blackness, may not be widely shared. With that in mind, I want to close by offering other quite brief examples which I believe point to this moment in which the possibilities and interpretations of the live have been expanded and of course tested by the global pandemic. First, I have asserted that live performance is a state of mind, an imagined co-presence in time with others. I hope this is not controversial, especially since it is something that we are currently doing at this very moment. It is the assumption that stands at the center of video conference play readings like Zoom theater, but most successfully in an audio or podcast theater. I am partial to Ike Holter's play I Hate It Here from just this year, 2021, which is an audio play that tackles the issue of systemic racism. Composed like an album consisting of a series of audio tracks, the play leaves it up to its audience to decide, as one would with a conventional music album or a book, how to engage it. In the language of music, do you play it all sort of straight through or shuffle? And how does the experience change based on the individual audience's members' remix? Second, I've contended that the live carries within it a sense of immediacy which can prompt a fear of missing out. In the course of the pandemic, there have been innumerable stream productions which, because of contractual restrictions, could not be recorded. Comparable to a theatrical run, they were of limited duration. Or you can think of Verses, right, in which the fact that you might miss the blurb, the bubble of Oprah or Mariah Carey or Michelle Obama. That's what will keep you glued to your seat and be there live rather than trying to just sort of sneak off for that bathroom run or the snack. Although I focused upon the agency of the audience member to frame and to define the sensation of this live, this sort of fear of missing out on something, I acknowledge that there are performances in which the agency, the stage presence, the charisma, choose your preferred term, of the individual can radically overwhelm the work itself and create the dynamic of immediacy. And here I want to point to Shia LaBeouf and his reading, this sort of Zoom theater reading of the screenplay for Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Whose projected, performed, invented story world seems to exceed the confines the Zoom box offered, and to the point that it transforms his co-stars into amused audience members as well.
Eating in this class. You get used to doing your own business on your own time. That's one demand I make. I don't like staying after class with you on detention. That's my time.
Hen finally turns as if he has just noticed the sound at the door and opens the door an inch. Jeffrey Spicoli stands in the doorway, red eyes glistening, his long blonde hair still wet and streaming down the back of his white peasant shirt. He grins, oblivious to such trivial matters as attendance bells. A student sitting next to Stacy turns to his friends.
That guy's been stoned since the 3rd grade.
Yes?
Yeah. I'm registered for this class here.
What class?
This class is U.S. history. It's the globe right there. It's planet history. It's a space class.
Really?
Yeah, I'm in this class. Can I enter the space? I mean, I'm in this class.
No, please. I get so lonely when the 3rd attendance bell rings and I don't see all my kids here.
It's a comedy class? Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's confusing for me as well because there's all these changes. When they went from the A block
Mr.
to
Spicoli?
AB blocks, and they split it, then it became 2 separate schedules.
Mr. Spicoli!
Yeah. Yes.
Mr. Hand slowly tears the card into little pieces and sprinkles the pieces over his wastebasket. Spicoli watches in disbelief. His hands are frozen in the process of removing his backpack.
You ripped my cards out.
Yes.
You
got nothing to say?
You're a big dick, buddy.
Thanks to LaBeouf, Fast Times as a reading becomes an intensely live event, in part because it seems so uncertain about what will come next. It is an improvisation upon a script in a manner not unlike Verses, and of course, what we normally would expect to see within the theater. Third and finally, I've called attention to the ways that embedded within liveness is an invocation to community achieved through an appeal to memory and a looking back. The live revives. It gives breath, life back to George Floyd so that he can live again. It overlays the past and the present in Verses. As we head into the summer festival season, I'm intrigued by the way that select theaters, and here I'm thinking about the Shaw and Stretford festivals in Ontario, how they've embraced outdoor tent performances as a way to respond to the pandemic. In this return to the outdoors, which I consider a nostalgic return to the roots of theater, there is a reclamation of a theater past premised on the idea that liveness is not about the frame of theater, whether they be the doors into a theater or the box of a Zoom grid, but rather it is the felt experience of being with others. It is the recognition and at times the imagination of the emergence of community through the act of attending a performance event. Ultimately, this is what the live is. Although the live can be imagined, as I've suggested, imagining a larger presence of spectators at Pipeline or the assembly inspired by Verses, I think that we would all prefer to be together in time and in person. Certainly I wish that we could be in an actual room together rather than in this virtual space. I thank you for your attendance and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.